Ruby Rose had a plan. That was usually enough to scare off her sister. It would probably also have her dad locking the doors and Zui hiding under the bed. But she wasn't at home, and she hadn't told her sister, so it was fine. What's more, her team didn't know about the unfortunate circumstances that tended to dog her plans. Circumstances that were totally out of her control, and definitely weren't a result of bad planning, no matter what Yang said. Plus, they were kinda supposed to follow her orders as team leader, so it was that when Ruby announced her big plan to try and fix her sister's team, Ren and Nora were forced to listen. And what had led to the current situation, as Ruby shuffled beneath the covers of her bed, sliding over so that she could sit with legs crossed, the thin covers draped over her head like a tent. "I don't understand why we're doing this," Ren said from where he sat, opposite her. "Because it's a secret meeting, duh." Nora rolled her eyes and gave a fist bump to Ruby. Nora was awesome like that. She also understood her reasoning for doing things, their hidden society bedsheets included. "Go on then, Supreme Leader." "Thanks, Nora," Ruby said. "Anyway, the first meeting of R&R is a go." "Rest and relaxation?" Ren sounded interested, but was shushed as Ruby went on. "It's Ruby, Nora, and Ren." Ruby didn't pay attention as the young man deflated. "And we're here to try and figure out what's wrong with Jaune." "You mean, apart from his general attitude?" "Apart from that." She rolled her eyes. "But I mean, what caused it? And why did he end up like that? I just want to understand him so I can help him." "And why bring us into that?" Ren asked. "I can understand not asking Pyrrha, but what makes you think we could be of use?" "Pyrrha doesn't get on with him. She'd help if I asked her to. She's nice like that. But she wouldn't enjoy it. I don't want to make her do something she doesn't want to do. But you and Nora both knew Jaune when he was younger, right?" Some people called her slow, but it wasn't like she couldn't read between the lines of what Ren had said in the cafeteria. "We did." He nodded. "Though only for a day. It was when we visited a small town. I can't recall the name. We were being harassed by some local children and Jaune came to our aid." Ren's brows furrowed as he let out a long sigh. "He's changed a lot since then." "He actually came to help you?" Ruby asked. Ren nodded. "Without being forced to." "Back then he was very different. The way he carried himself. I don't think I realized at the time. But looking back on it, he acted like an adult even then. It didn't feel like someone our own age, but rather, someone much older breaking up a fight. He didn't even recognize us." Nora sulked. "We made a promise to be friends when we reached Beacon, but when we saw him, he didn't even come up to us." Yikes. It was worse than Ruby had feared. A broken childhood promise was big. It was huge. You could do a lot in a life, but promises made as a kid were sacred. Her video games had made that very, very clear. "Well, there has to be a reason for that, right?" Ruby said. "A reason for him to have changed into what he is now. People don't just change for no reason." Ruby knew that. She remembered how her dad had changed. When Mum died. She could also remember how Yang had changed, though her older sister had slowly started to come back. Their father still hadn't, though he tried his best. "I suppose that makes sense. Well, I want to try and figure out what that is so we can help him." Ruby looked first to Ren and then to Nora, the latter of which looked determined already. If Jaune went from being this super awesome and kind guy to someone like this, then something must have happened to him. The three of them pondered that suggestion for long moments. Ruby wasn't sure what, since she hadn't known him for long, but there was something there, something she wasn't sure on. His attitude does share some similarities to depression. Ren's eyes were narrowed, one hand rubbing his chin. The image might have looked more impressive were it not for the fat white sheets that pulled around his ears. I hadn't considered it before, but it is possible. And then we can fix him? Nora asked. Ruby nodded. That part of her plan was still the vague part, but she was sure they'd think of something in time. Phase 1 was figuring out what was wrong with him. Phase 2 was something or other. And Phase 3 was Jaune being happy and everyone being best friends. And Yang said she couldn't pull off plans. Dumbass. Then let's do it. Oh, Rennie, if we fix him, then we can have our friend back. We are so doing this. Ruby turned to look at the single man in the group as well, making sure to hold her hands under her chin and stare unblinkingly into his eyes. She was impressed. He actually managed to hold her gaze for a solid 8 seconds. I never said I wouldn't help. He sighed as he looked away. You can both stop with the looks. Nora and Ruby shared another high five. But that doesn't mean this will be easy. He went on. Whatever happened to him, Jaune isn't as sociable now. He isn't going to talk just because you go up and ask him what's wrong. Ruby drew out the notebook she kept on the bed behind her, opening it to her, help Jaune page and scribbling out the first suggestion that was on the list. She thought it was such a good idea too, very direct. Hey, why did Ren have his head in his hands? Ruby? He sighed. Give me the notebook. It's a list of ideas I was coming up with so far. She was quite proud of them actually. She spent the last 20 minutes before bed writing them down. That was more effort than she put into homework. Ren flipped through the 3 or 4 pages, brows drawing close as he muttered something she couldn't hear. Hugs. He said at last. How are hugs going to solve this? Hugs are good, Ruby explained, like she was talking to a child. Hugs share the happiness from one person to another. I figured that if he won't talk, then I won't force him. I'll just hug him and hug him until he shares my happiness. Breaks down and, well, explains what's wrong. Then I'll help him. She played a few video games in which that happened, though those were the video games Yang wasn't allowed to see. The kind she quickly switched the TV off and pretended to be doing her homework if she so much as heard Yang exist near the door to her room. Jaune. Ruby. Ren rubbed a hand through his hair. He isn't some kind of piñata that you can hug and expect answers to come popping out of. What would you have ever done if that didn't work? More hugs. More hugs. More hugs. She nodded. Then Nora could have helped too. The ginger girl crossed her arms and nodded impressively. The only thing Nora's hugs would have helped with is suffocating him. Ren tore the page from the notebook, ignoring her pained gasp. Beta plan, no! She'd even spent time decorating that page with doodles and scythes and pictures of roses. Cookie? No. You know what? Let's start afresh, and this time, I'll be the one to write down the plans. Ruby fumed but let it go. This was for the far greater good after all, so there had to be sacrifices. The first thing we need to do is try and identify what is wrong with Jaune, and for that we're going to need evidence. Ren tapped her brightly coloured action hero pen on the notepad. We're not going to be able to get a full idea unless we look at each individual aspect, so I want the two of you to list things that you've noticed. Ruby and Nora rattled off a list of things. Ren accepted some with quiet hums, while gently dissuading others. Before long, the trio had a neat list of, well, Ruby guessed they were character traits. Lazy, sad, quiet, does not respond to bullying, does not respond to others being bullied, little homework, does not smile, does not pay attention in class. There were a few others as well, but they could mostly be categorized as things that have already been listed. Opposite that was something different. Words that seemed to paint a picture of somebody completely different from the man she called friend. Determined, kind, protective, mature, altruistic, brave, loves his family. I remember seeing him with his sisters before. Ruby admitted as she read that last one. Family was important to her and Yang, so she found her finger tracing over the word as if it somehow carried more weight. When you fought Torchwick? She hadn't thought much of it at the time, mainly because she hadn't seen much of him. Sure, he teased her with the line about what Osmond would do, but it wasn't like they had talked much. Ruby had been fighting Torchwick's goons at the front of the store, and had only really arrived in time to see Jaune be defeated by the Crook. She didn't even see their fight. She hadn't even mentioned it to Jaune, mostly because it didn't seem like something that needed to be. She could ask him, and he would say that yes, it was him, and nothing would happen. Did you see if he was protecting his sisters? Ren asked. Ruby shook her head. I didn't see his fight, though I guess he must have. They were safe while he was hurt, but Torchwick might have attacked only him. Why? When we first met him, he seemed to be very protective over his younger sister. Obviously we made no moves against her, but even when she nearly tripped it looked like he was ready to catch her at a moment's notice. He seemed terrified of letting harm come to her. Just like Yang used to be, Ruby realized. Back when we were younger, after the incident, Yang had dodged her steps with almost determined protectiveness. It had honestly been really weird. Did that really mean he was like Yang? But she got better. Once she realized Ruby wasn't made of glass and wasn't going to explode into 1,000 pieces if she just stepped away. I think it's safe to say that that personality trait hasn't changed. Ren sketched a circle around the word. But a lot of the others seem to contrast. His altruism from when we first met him, and for his apathy now, for instance. He wasn't being cruel. Ruby protested. When he didn't want to help that girl. Sure, it hadn't been right for him to do nothing, but that didn't make him bad either. Carden had been bad, since he took pleasure in it. But Jaune wasn't like that. Or at least she thought he wasn't. I never said it was. It's just that what he would have done when he was younger is so much different. He is so much different. It feels like I'm being introduced to a different person who just so happens to share the same name and face. Ruby wasn't sure what she was supposed to say. This wasn't going as well as any of them had hoped. The best we can do is to keep an eye on him today, Ren said at last. Perhaps if we focus on how he acts during the day, we might be able to have a better idea when we next meet. Okay? Okay, Rennie. Nora cheered. Ruby nodded, all the glad to have the two on board with her grand strategy. What are the three of you doing? The voice came from outside the wall of blankets, a dark shape appearing through the thin material. Ah! We've been discovered! Nora cried, and if they hadn't been before, then she surely would have given the game away. Evacuate! Evacuate! The girl planted both feet against Ren's chest and helped him off the bed. He took the bed sheets with him, rappelling off the edge where he collapsed onto the floor in a tangled heap of white cloth. Pyrrha raised one eyebrow at the two girls. The crumpled mess that was Lie Ren could only groan. Ruby shook her head at the memory of that morning. Pyrrha had rolled her eyes and written off their silliness as early morning play, and likely was no closer to guessing their true objective. Her partner would have been totally supportive of the plan. Ruby knew that, but she would have been supportive because she felt like she had to be supportive. Ruby didn't want that. She didn't want Pyrrha to feel like she had to do what she didn't want to do, just because Ruby said so. That wasn't how friendship worked. That wasn't how a team worked. The older girl didn't seem to fully get that, Ruby could tell. She always looked like someone afraid she would make a mistake, that she would say something and Ruby would stop considering her a friend. I'll prove her wrong as well, Ruby grinned. In the same way she would help Jaune, she'd help Pyrrha too. Except that there wasn't any grand plan for Pyrrha. Just time and proof that friendship wouldn't go away would be enough. This was a plan she could solve with hugs, no matter what Ren thought. But for now, it was time to focus on a secret mission. One headed down to her by Overlord Ren. Ruby started to hum some spy music in her head, increasing the volume as she approached her targets. They didn't even notice. Such was her stealth. She could ambush them at any moment's notice, striking from behind while... "Will you quit that infernal humming?" Sneak growled from behind her textbook. "Eee! Oh, fiddlesticks!" She'd been humming that out loud, hasn't she? "Hi, Rubes." Yang leaned back to wave. The two of them were on their own out in the gardens. "Hi, Yang." Ruby returned and flopped down between them. "Hi, Weiss." The heiress grumbled something that Ruby magnanimously pretended to believe that might have been a greeting. Oh yeah, Pyrrha had definitely been the best choice of a partner. "What are you up to?" "Relaxing." Her sister laid back down on the grass. "The weather is good for it, and we have most of the day off thanks to that field trip tomorrow." Ruby hummed in agreement. Miss Goodwitch was taking them on some trip to collect sap for Professor Peach. They'd been told to bring their full equipment, which meant there was risk of combat. Ruby could hardly wait. But that wasn't her mission today. "Where's Jaune?" "Oh?" Yang shifted so that she was laid on her side, head popped up on one hand. "Any reason you're looking for our lazy leader? Is my little sister finally discovering the male species?" Yang's expression turned complicated. "I'm not sure I'm the best person to wit your teeth on." "I know he's not." Weiss added, No, I'm not crushing on him." Ruby shook her head. "It's just, well, I usually see him with you around this time." Normally, Weiss would still be chasing him around the track. And I would be now, the girl said, were it not for the fact that he actually did it himself this morning. Huh? Had they killed Jaune and replaced him with someone else while she wasn't looking? Surprised, huh? Yang grinned, but he actually jogged with us all this morning and didn't even put up much of a fuss. Much of a fuss for him. Weiss corrected. He still whined worse than a 10-year-old child. Yang shrugged but didn't argue, even as Ruby looked back and forth between the two. Jaune agreed to train. That just didn't make sense. It didn't compute. Was he sick? Ruby had to ask. Yang burst out laughing. Even the heiress allowed a tiny smile to spread across her lips. Sick of being forced into it, maybe. Her sister said. Weiss is right. He still moaned like normal, but he put up with it and completed the training. I think he just agreed because he knew it would force him into it anyways. And you let him go afterwards? Of course. Weiss said. I'm not about to look a gift horse in the mouth. If it's true that he agreed for the sake of avoiding being forced into it, then I'm not going to prove him wrong by doing just that. Otherwise he would just resist any training in the future. Ruby still didn't understand. Weiss must have noticed. Think of it like training a dog. If you offer them a treat for obedience, but then withhold it, then you simply teach them to resent you. Jaune's not a dog. Ruby's eyes narrowed. It was just an example. I am well aware that my partner is human. No animal could be so difficult to deal with. Ruby calmed down a little at hearing that. It was just that, well, she didn't like hearing people insult her friends. So she was a little defensive, okay? You can be difficult to deal with too. Ruby wished she could take back the words the moment she uttered them. Apparently Yang did too. Considering how the girl rapidly scooted away from her teammate. Pardon? There was enough ice in that single word to make Ruby's legs freeze. Damn my mouth. Well, I'm just saying, maybe you and Jaune don't get on because you're always pushing him around? It was too late to back out now, especially with the icy look Weiss gave her. so Ruby squared her shoulders and stood firm. A hysterical part of her mind noted how her beloved and protective older sister was definitely not about to come to her aid. It's not like I want to push him around. The aura of dread receded, taken away as the older girl looked aside with a sigh. And I have tried speaking with him. He stonewalls my every attempt, or tries to distract me in some way. I fought after. She paused to take a breath. We had discussion about team leaders, where I accepted him as mine and promised to help him become a better leader, a better hunter. I thought after that, we had reached some kind of common ground, but he instantly went back to his usual lazy self, refusing to take part in any training or actually lead the team. Maybe that's just the way he is. Ruby whispered. She froze, however, when the girl glared at her. And will the Grim accept that excuse? Should I accept it? When I come across my partner's broken and bloody body, that it was okay for me to give up and not do any more? Because being lazy was just the way he was? No. Ruby wilted under the girl's stare. It was hard to argue with that kind of image. I don't want to be the one always running around hitting him with a stick. Weiss went on. But in lieu of a carrot, this is all I have. If the carrot has to be that training with me means I'll give him an afternoon off, then so be it. He's ahead of homework anyway. Should she say sorry? Ruby wasn't sure. She knew it was wrong of her to judge them like that, especially since she wasn't even part of their team. Ugh, this is more complicated than I thought it would be. Are you worried about tomorrow? She asked instead. No, not at all. Ruby continued to stare at her, until the white-haired girl sighed. I'm not worried because we'll all be together. There shouldn't be any risk. Even if there was, I trust he would be able to deal with it accordingly. He's lazy, not incompetent. That might have come across as supportive. If it weren't for the mumbled, I hope not anyway, tacked on the end. But what if he doesn't know how to fight the Grim? Ruby asked. Her sister and Weiss stared at her. Ruby looked between the two of them, recognizing the pitying looks of someone who wasn't sure if the person they were looking at was completely sound. What? I'm serious. Fighting Cardin is one thing, if you can call that a fight, but the Grim could really hurt him. He survived a Deathstalker initiation, Yang pointed out. Not to mention the Grim from 3 days ago. Recall the locker incident? Weiss said. Yeah, but those were accidents. Ruby laughed. They tripped. The two stared at her once more. The pitying looks have returned in full force. What? The amount of blood? Weiss hinted. One brow raised. Ruby tilted her head. The patches of ground? The broken branches? The fact that his clothing was almost completely ruined? Oh. Ruby made a sound of understanding, followed by a nervous laugh. Of course I totally get what you're saying. Like, who wouldn't? She'd ask Ren later. I don't even know why I try. Weiss sighed. Oh, you're so adorable when you don't notice things. Ruby yelped as her older sister reached over to snatch her hood, drawing her in so that she could crush the smaller girl into a hug. Ruby's legs kicked in protest as she howled and fought to escape. My cute little Rue baby. Roast down, roast down. I've been captured by the enemy. Go on without me, guys.